Bob Uecker, who had a day job, he was the voice of the Milwaukee Brewers on the radio, did the play-by-play. Didn't play in the major leagues very long, had a short career in the major leagues, but was beloved, ended up in the Hall of Fame. He ended up in the Hall of Fame as a broadcaster, and he earned the nickname Mr. Baseball. Bob Uecker. He died at the age of 90. The prepared statement from the family and the Brewers that the voice of the Brewers, Bob Uecker, the voice of the team, over 50 years. He had a private battle with lung cancer, and that was back starting in early 2023. And so Bob Uecker dying here, the voice of the Brewers, starting in 1971. Now, to put that in perspective, the Brewers had only been in Wisconsin for a year at that time. It was the second year. He took over in year 2. They had been the Seattle Pilots, and he remained on that job until his death. From 1971 until this week, Bob Uecker had the play-by-play, had the microphone of the Milwaukee Brewers. And he's known nationally for being a comedic voice, multiple TV shows and whatnot. An amazing tale from a guy as a baseball player. As a baseball player, not much going on, right? Not much. He played in St. Louis, and he was part of a World Series, friends with Bob Gibson, Tim McCarver, some legends back in those days in the 1960s for the St. Louis Cardinals. But the questions we discuss here, Bob Uecker dying at the age of 90, what are your reflections of his life? So I've got on the bench the Fumblerooski and the Intertube. But the first part of this is going to be all about Bob Uecker. So Bob Uecker was Prince Charming with a sense of humor. Prince Charming, didn't have the matinee idol looks. He obviously didn't make it because he was a good-looking dude, but he was charismatic. He had this magnetic personality, which people just gravitated to, self-deprecating humor. He was willing to laugh at himself, and a life well lived. Now, I was lucky enough to meet Bob Uecker a few times in my journey in gasbaggery here, my travels. Some of you may know back in the day, I was lucky enough to have a job where I traveled around with the Doyers when they sucked, not now that they're good. But anyway, one of my fondest memories was when I was futzing around with the Dodgers, and we were at the old County Stadium in Milwaukee, and it was late in the year. It was like August. It was kind of a hot day in Milwaukee, and it was humid, kind of nasty. It was a getaway day. It was a day game. For the Brewers would play a day game, Dodgers had to go to the next town. So they played a day game, and it was pregame. There was like a breakfast. I didn't eat the breakfast in the media dining room, and Bob Uecker was in there, and he was regaling some of the media blowhards with stories. I was just sitting in there and telling stories about his days as a player, his days on Mr. Belvedere, which was a TV show, and all these different stuff. He did like a blooper show, like a sports highlight show. I mean, he had a syndicated TV show, did a bunch of stuff. I also, at Dodger Stadium one time, I was a fly on the wall, and I overheard a conversation between Vin Scully and Bob Uecker. They would schmooze and go back and forth. And so those are fond memories I have. But Bob Uecker spent a lot of time as a player on the bench, and he made a lot of jokes about it, but he ended up, now that we can look back and do the retrospective on his life, he was on the bench, but he was a mensch on the bench is what he was, Bob Uecker, stand-up guy. He did the World Series. The first World Series I covered was, a long time. It was 28 years ago. It was 1997. The Marlins played the Cleveland Indians, and Bob Uecker called that World Series. If I remember correctly, it was Bob Uecker, Joe Morgan, and I believe Bob Costas, I think, called that World Series. But he was there calling the network broadcast. And people just loved him. He was a sweetheart guy. He had that Svengali effect, great storyteller. And that's how you end up back when people used to watch late-night television before it all went woke, and people tuned in every night. It was like must-see TV to see late-night TV. The most famous person in America when I was a kid was Johnny Carson. And Bob Uecker appeared on that show, I think it was 100 times, which is either the most or it's in the top 5 appearances on that show, which was a big deal at the time. It was a really big deal. And it was all about self-deprecation and this mesmerizing ability to tell stories, the deadpan delivery that he had. And for a guy that really wasn't much of a baseball player and was doing games in Milwaukee to end up as a character on a sitcom, I mentioned Mr. Belvedere. That's pretty big. But the biggest role of them all, without a doubt, if you're around my age, was Harry Doyle, the sarcastic, inebriated broadcaster for the Cleveland Indians in Major League in 1989. They made 2 other movies after that, but the original was where it's at. And so many lines that Bob Uecker, we are told, just ad-libbed many of those, are still used today. All these years later, that piece of pop culture still lives in the nonsense that Bob Uecker said, just a bit outside, right? Ball 12, that kind of thing. All right, now, secondly, we're going to move away from Bob Uecker. We'll get back to him in a little bit. But I wanted to move away. There's some other stuff going on. The pinwheel goes round and round over to the Big Apple. We have learned now that Pete Alonso, Pete Alonso has rejected a 3-year contract offer from the New York Mets, an offer that would have paid Pete Alonso about $70 million. And the Metropolitans have already supposedly moved on. They're pivoting away from the polar bear. So the question for the class is why would Pete Alonso not agree to that deal? Why are they parting ways here? Why would he not agree to the contract? So after spending a few good minutes trying to figure this one out, and I'm not a Mets fan, I got no skin in the game on this. This is an epic misjudgment, and there's some machismo involved in this because you've got the polar bear who essentially pulled a fumble-rooski, the old trick play that backfired. Is it true that Pete Alonso said, no, I don't want your deal, a 7-year offer for in the neighborhood of $160 million a year ago? He bet on himself, Pete Alonso. And the thinking is that the polar bear, because of New York and all the home runs he hits, that branding would pay off in spades. Well, who goofed? I've got to know. In the eyes of the Mets, 1 year, and Pete Alonso can no longer get a 7-year contract. He can only get a 3-year contract. Now, this is not over yet. There could be a 180. There could be a 180 here where they go back the other direction. However, clearly the Mets are at best, they're turning the screws on Alonso. They're using their media friends, their useful idiots in the media, to put pressure on the polar bear, for Pete's sake. And there's really no obvious fallback option for a guy like Pete Alonso. Where are you going to go? Go out and lose a bunch of games for the Giants for half a year and then get traded somewhere else to a contender, or the Toronto Blue Jays or the Angels, or my favorite, mystery team. I love the mystery team. When you look at Alonso, he's not old, but he's aging. He's over the age of 30 at this point. He's essentially a one-trick player. He hits a lot of home runs, and home runs are important, but you got to do a little bit other than that. And he bet on himself. He did not have the kind of year to get rewarded, and he has shown obvious signs of decay and rotting over the last couple of years. So he's so upset he turned down the big contract, 7 years. To save face, he can't agree to the 3-year contract, so now he's going to have to run off and go play for the Brewers or the Blue Jays or the Twins or somebody like that. All right, final thought. Turning the page to the NFL. Parsing the words on these end-of-season eulogies that are going on from NFL executives. Now, Brian Gutekunst, got to make sure you say that name slowly. That is a tough name, Gutekunst. So he wants the Packers to ramp up their sense of urgency. He made these comments this week. We're going to ramp up the sense of urgency. So how do you decode this? So he said that, hey, we got a bunch of good guys here, a bunch of talented players and all that. But he said the sense of urgency to win Super Bowls, that they need to improve that. So by the process of elimination, this is a referendum, an indirect referendum, scattershot style, at Matt LaFleur, the coach of the Green Bay Packers. Now, Gutekunst implied that some of the guys were slacking off. Otherwise, you wouldn't need a sense of urgency unless players were floating on an inner tube, drinking a cocktail, going round the lazy river. Lollygagging, may I add. They were satisfied to be in the playoffs. Now, I got to tell you, it looked like that's a team that was not ready to play. They gave a half-hearted effort in Philadelphia. The Eagles were plumb to be beaten. Right, they were primed for the beating. And Green Bay came out. It's hard to argue that they were not locked in that game. They did not have a sense of urgency. They fumbled the opening bloody kickoff. Jordan Love tossed 3 interceptions, 2 of them while the game was in the margins. It was a royally pathetic performance is what it was.